I hope you have your mask on. You're going to need it for this guy who's coming up next. I am talking with Dr. Paul Louis Metzger. And we're going to talk about the intersection. Hey, where's your mask, bro?
Well, I can't compete with you in any way, whether it's with a beard or a mask, so why even try?
Yeah. We're doing social distancing anyway, so I can't stay in that thing too long. I don't know how those plague doctors survived.
Something from the 16th century right there, Phil. So
that's right.
Paintings of Luther with the plague, and people are there wearing those same kinds of masks. So very good.
Well, Luther and I have the same birthday.
Do you really?
We do. Yeah. This is
my same love too. You have the same love, beer.
That's right. You must have the same birthday. Unfortunately, this is not a beer time because it's a little early in the morning for me, at least to be pulling a beer.
Before you had the great picture up from when we were together for the Grand Initiative. So
yeah, that's right. We gotta show people the picture here.
There it is.
That's it. And and I made the statement that
me and Gandalf. So.
And I made the statement about your wicked little grin. So, Dr. Paul Louis Metzger, you're a professor at Multnomah.
That's correct.
And so tell us a little bit about your specialities and what you do at Multnomah.
Okay. Thanks, Phil. It's great to be with you and your cadre, your groupies, whatever you want to call it, your friends, and now hope to be their friends too, their friend as well. Paul Louis Metzger. I am a professor in theology and culture at Multnomah University and Seminary in Portland, Oregon. I direct an institute in theology of culture, New Wine, New Wineskins, and through my work in multi-faith engagement, I've had the privilege to work with Phil and other friends of ours like John Moorhead, some of you may know, on a Louisville Grant Initiative. And that's really how I connected with Reverend Wyman. So it's great to be with you, Phil.
I don't know how much reverence there is in the Reverend Wyman, but So, by the way, Jill O'Reilly is watching.
Hello. Yeah. Be with you.
And I've got a friend that I'm expecting to be asking some questions. He's a molecular biologist out of Cardiff University in Wales. Andrew Thomas is watching as well, so he'll be asking some questions, I'm sure. So you've done some work in this intersection of religion and science, right?
That's right.
And so just tell us a little bit about how you've done that and where that's happened, and give us a little background of that.
Great. Well, so as I said a few minutes ago, I work in the area of theology and culture and direct this institute, New Wine, New Wineskins. And so several years ago, we had the privilege of doing a grant initiative with the American Association for the Advancement of Science at Multnomah Biblical Seminary, and New Wine, New Wineskins coordinated that as a program, as an institute at the university and seminary. So we worked with AAAS, again, American Association for the Advancement of Science, right, through an initiative with the Templeton Foundation, and then also our accrediting body, the the Association of Theological Schools, rather. Okay. Association of Theological Schools. So one of 10 pilot initiatives where AAAS discerned that, if you're really wanting to engage the Christian community toward an effective, constructive dialogue on science, right, especially amongst evangelicals, you're going to have to do it through engaging pastors. Because whether pastors are familiar with science or not, congregants are first, going to go to their pastors on questions of faith and science. And so I really appreciated the fact that AAAS was discerning, how do we engage with the broader community where so many people feel that science is not for human flourishing, not for the common good. Their whole aim is to make it about the common good. And they're not a faith-based organization, to say the least.
Right.
They had people across the spectrum, from atheists to devout Jewish, Christian, et cetera, people. But they were just trying to engage people from whatever sector of society, including the Christian faith community. And so they wanted to do an initiative with seminaries in North America, accredited seminaries, where they would help the seminary profs train the students, future pastors that is, with science advisors, scientific content through AAAS, helping us get the advisors in the sciences, so that we could actually provide good scientific content. And we are theologians, we're not scientists, and we know our limitations, hopefully. And so, but we were drawing from, rigorous science, working with AAAS, working with the advisors we had and other guest speakers, so that we could help train pastors, not that they become scientists as such, but they would know where to go when they had questions, where they would really approach things perhaps with greater attentiveness to methodologies as it relates to these matters, and to build trust, not where the two are conflated, not where there's this forced collaboration, but as we said with our own grant initiative, to cultivate an informed respect for the two branches between faith and science, to cultivate an informed respect, and where possible to move toward integration. We can't always move toward integration. There will be at points conflict and tension because of disciplines, but where we can, to seek that out, but in a way that honors the distinctiveness of the different traditions. So that was gold to us. We did that for 3+ years, and then I was an advisor to them in terms of the overarching work as a theological advisor for this program, Science for Seminaries, for Dozer at AAAS. And I'm still overseeing, as an advisor, so to speak, a couple of grants for other seminaries now, where I serve as an ally, someone who's gone through it before. And it's just been a delight. I'm really grateful for the opportunity. And at the seminary, Multnomah Seminary, we were really grateful. We did it in about 10 classes, from historiography, to pastoral care, to biblical studies, to theology and culture, etc.
So you're dealing with pastors, and primarily evangelical pastors, and you're trying to help inform them, or at least get them to engage with the scientific community, right? And what kind of problems did you run into in trying to do that? Well, with evangelical did you have some difficulties?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. But I mean, I think we were well prepared. We had our FAQs, frequently asked questions, ready to go. Because the conflict thesis doesn't just pop up amongst, let's say, atheists. And there are different stripes of atheists. I work with atheists and have great interaction with secular humanists. That's not the problem. It's more the dyed-in-the-wool, strident conflict theorists, like a Dawkins, for example, where it becomes problematic. Someone like E.O. Wilson is, I find, much more ironic, even as a devout atheist, in how he engages the faith community. But be that as it may, you don't have just the strident conflict theorists amongst certain forms of atheists. You also have it amongst evangelicals and pastors. Not all. I mean, we had many who were very appreciative, passionate about it, but you will have some who are going to be very concerned, thinking that this is selling out the faith. And and what we were really trying to do, and what we're always trying to do, is to cultivate healthy conversations, open-ended conversations. Hopefully I don't try and make it such that you have to agree with me at every turn to have a conversation on faith and science, but are we even aware of the various factors, the questions that need to be asked? And there are a variety of questions. And of course, the one that comes most to mind for people is evolution and creationism. And one of the individuals I've had the privilege of working with who spoke at our conference is Josh Swamidas at Washington University in St. Louis, who just came out with a book on that whole theme. And he runs a group called Peaceful Science. I encourage people to check that out. I'm an advisor to their work in the theological sphere. Just with my mom passing away this spring, it's
Right.
caused me to have to go slow on a variety of things in the recent past. But I am thrilled to be partnering with Josh and his team and what they're doing at Peaceful Science, Josh Swamidas. There's someone who is dealing with creation and evolution, but
Right.
not in a way that's trying to polarize, but let's cultivate a more constructive conversation. Of course, you have BioLogos and a new
Right.
group that I encourage people to consider, Science for the Church,
Right.
that
Mm-hmm.
is out there. That's really great work. So all that to say, Phil, creation and evolution is the one that we had to deal with most right out of the gate. And I just encourage people to be open to conversations with those that they would not normally have conversations with. And AAAS brings pastors and scientists together to try and build trust, not to have agreement at every turn, but have the conversation. Be open to engaging a variety of voices in the conversation. That was part of what we wanted to do. I had my students read Darwin, Origin of the
Yeah.
Species,
Yeah.
and such, and just say, what do you see here? Because a lot of them hadn't even dealt with him, but just secondhand, third-hand sources. And so, but that conflict thesis is just a killer, the Draper White conflict thesis. And
Right. Right. Right.
but
Did you find similar difficulty with the incompatibility thesis, where it just became a thing that people said, these worlds don't have anything to do with each other, and
yeah,
so we're not.
yeah,
Why do we talk about it?
yeah, Gould's Noma, right? I mean,
Right.
with what he talks about with, their non-overarching magisteria. And, and I
Right.
don't think that's the route to go either. But it doesn't mean it's easy. I mean, Ian Barber wrote a book on matters pertaining to scientific method, which is well worth the read. Uh, Let me just say this, though, that, evangelicals are dealing with science all the time. I mean, we often have
Right.
state-of-the-art technology that we draw from our multi-site campuses. Look at
We're
how evangelicals and charismatics
we're
are
masters at
cutting
it.
edge when it
Yeah.
comes to using TV, radio. I mean, back in the
Right.
day, some of those evangelists in the past. So the question is not, is science trustworthy or usable for faith? It's the question is, we pick and choose what we're going to draw from. And it's like, I'm just
Right.
saying, and if we're going to be in a place like Portland, Oregon, and that's how we framed our initiative, as Barna said many years ago, the Barna Group, that many young people are leaving the church in part because of what they perceive to be an antagonism between faith and science. So regardless of where a pastor is coming from or a church is coming from, at least enter into the conversation, because you have congregants, young people in your churches going into the scientific disciplines, and they often feel like they're marginalized because they don't have support for that. And they end up thinking the church is not a place for them. So at the very least, and in a place like Portland, which is not a bastion for Orthodox Christianity, we need to be more missional in that regard and enter into the
Right.
conversation. So that was the
Right. Right.
thrust, and that's the ongoing thrust for New Wineskins, and the work we're doing at the seminary.
Okay. So for those of you watching this right now, I put the links to Peaceful Science and BioLogos there in the comments. And
Yeah, and then also church, Science for the Church, Science for the Church with Drew Rick Miller,
okay.
and others.
Okay. Science for the Church, it's called. Um, Jim Fontaine, friend of mine in Essex, Mass, is asking the question, so what are some of the other facts? What are some of the other frequently asked questions that you were faced with pastors?
Yeah, so yeah, great question. That would have been one. Then another one that we dealt with a lot would just relate to themes of mental health. We did some forums at churches for new-wineskins.org. We did a variety of forums, and so often we have this kind of Cartesian dualism where the brain and the body are completely separate from one another, ghosts in the machine, however you want to frame it. And of course,
Right.
the
Right.
whole Aristotelian versus Descartesian or Cartesian dynamic, it's a tough one. It's a challenging one. People are concerned that with the Aristotelian framework that you'll have a reduction of
Right.
the brain to the body or the soulish dimension, whereas with Descartes, it's like, and we're framed by these conversations. That's old hat, but it's still those are major
Right.
players. They still, in certain respects, shape it. And so with Descartes, it's like, do the two ever meet? And I think in a lot of times in churches, you have people who think that if you have mental illness, well, it's a sin problem. And if we can help people see that the brain is not divorced from the body, that it's a bodily dynamic. So I mean, it's complicated, right? I mean, I'm not a neuroscientist, I'm not a psychiatrist, but we had, psychologists, we had counselors, we had psychiatrists working with us to take away the shame of it. I mean, I think you can have very godly people who struggle majorly with mental illness in a variety of ways. But that was a tough one for a lot of people, and that continues to be a tough one. So that was a factor. I think historiography, not just creation evolution, but historiography was a key facet for how we went at the issue. So, as I mentioned, the conflict thesis between that was framed by way of Draper and White is so much a part of the conversation today. You see it in Neil deGrasse Tyson. You saw it in Stephen Hawking. I mean, Neil deGrasse Tyson even brings it into Superman versus Batman. I mean, he's a brilliant scientist, just not a good historian. And so, that's so challenged by Ronald Numbers, by Gary Ferngren. I just interviewed Gary Ferngren from Oregon State University. Ronald Numbers, who was at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, did the book Galileo Goes to Jail. Gary Ferngren writes for John Hopkins Press on science and religion, medicine and religion, some cutting-edge books there. But the conflict thesis, helping pastors see that the history of science and faith is not one of just overarching conflict. Of course there's conflict, but it wasn't like with Galileo and company, and that's what we tried to show students too, is that it's a much more complicated conversation. A lot of things are much more complicated. And they don't, and we oversimplify. And so just to give an example, Galileo and the church, it had as much to do with Galileo's personality. The Pope had been his friend, but he had a way of making enemies with his personality. And it wasn't science versus religion. It was science versus science. They were dealing with different scientific models. And so Copernicus, and hopefully we'll have a chance to talk about Freud and Freud's own historiography, how damaging it was, and how it relates to Neil deGrasse Tyson. I hope we'll have a chance to talk about that.
So besides the Galileo story, the other one that stands out in terms of conflict thesis is obviously the Scopes trial, right?
Exactly.
Where science and religion hit head to head, and like you said, Galileo's story is very different. Different scientists going after each other, and who is going to get the funding? If we were to frame it today, right? That's where it would go. But it seems that there aren't a whole lot of other stories that stand out on this conflict thesis, at least in terms of such a big battle. And has there been an ignoring of the stories where religion has been beneficial to science?
Oh, absolutely. Let me just mention a book that I wanted to draw your attention to. Phil, I think you know Derek Peterson.
Yeah.
Used to work with me at New Wine, New Wineskins, a brilliant young historical theologian. He has a book coming out with Cascade this summer or autumn, and I just want to give the title, Flat Earths and Fake Footnotes. Flat Earths and Fake Footnotes, the strange tale of how the conflict of science and Christianity was written into history. And Derek Peterson, that's 2 R's and Peterson, S-O-N. I'm
looking forward to that. That's
and Derek goes through a lot of these conflict issues and tries to explain what happened, how they happened. And students have always, he's a graduate of the college at Multnomah and the seminary, and will be going on for doctoral studies at some point. But I just have been so grateful for the conversations with Derek. He was assisting me. I was leading the grant initiative for the seminary at New Wine, and just great insights. So Derek Peterson, be looking for that Flat Earths and Fake Footnotes book. But if I can I go to the Scopes trial just a minute?
Please do, yeah.
So George Marsden, in his classic text of on fundamentalism, says you cannot overestimate the impact of the Scopes trial on the fundamentalist psyche. I think that's where we get a lot of the,
Okay.
East Coast, media is liberal, with H.L. Mencken and his hostility toward William Jennings Bryan and the evangelicals. You had, the Take Back America, Lose America. In the 19th century, evangelicals were at the center of the public square, key in terms of the whole thrust of abolition and
Right.
other dynamics, pushing Lincoln, just like Wilberforce and company had pushed Parliament in the
Right.
United Kingdom. But you have this removing from the public square in the early 20th century for a variety of reasons, not just one. But the Scopes trial, the impact of that on the fundamentalist evangelical psyche is still with us today.
Right.
And the kind of suspicion that we have so often towards science in our circles, and I think it's with us with the coronavirus in many respects as well. So perhaps we'll have opportunity to talk about that. But yeah, we cannot underestimate it. It's huge. It damages our psyche. It shows up in how we engage on faith and science with our Buddhist friends. That's
Right.
something
Right.
we
Right.
talked about at length.
So, describe that effect. What has it done on the evangelical psyche? Certainly, it's obvious what it's done to the public psyche about evangelicals. But has it done something specifically to the individual psyche in its relationship to the rest of society?
Yes. So just how we engage, you're asking.
Right, right. What has the Scopes monkey trial done for us evangelicals in terms of how we think about the world, or pastors in general?
Yeah, and if people don't know the context, I'm assuming your audience does, but just for the sake of making sure we're all on the same page, Dayton, Tennessee,
Right.
Scopes, I believe, was a science teacher in the public school system. Evolution was not allowed to be taught in the school system, as I recall.
Right.
And I wasn't there. You might think I was by the coloring of my beard, but
well, I was there.
I wasn't going to say, but he became a symbol of pushing against the law and pushing for it, the teaching of evolution. And so he was teaching it in the public school, and I think they wanted it to go to trial. That's my sense. They wanted to go to trial. They lost the trial. Those
Right.
Darrow, and company. I mean, he wasn't supposed to do it, but they won a cultural victory. The victory of William Jennings Bryan and such was a Pyrrhic victory. It only lasted a very short while because it was obvious he was going to be found guilty. But the damage it did to the psyche, Bryan died like within 2 weeks, and he was a darling. He'd been, I think, Secretary of the State or a vice presidential candidate. He was seen as David fighting the Goliaths, and I won't get into all that. But when he died, just a couple of weeks later, I think it was H.L. Mencken, the liberal journalist, who said, "We killed the blank and blank." I won't say the word on air, but it was the hostility was very, very thick, and I think the pain of that. Evangelicalism was historically, and fundamentalism and evangelicalism has to be distinguished in and of itself.
Right.
We don't have time in this program, I'm sure, to get into all that, what distinguishes the two, but they're often conflated in the broader sphere. I have a lot of people telling me I should give up the label evangelical because of all of its associations today, but I say I ain't giving it up. I'm not allowing this public figure or that public figure to dictate to me what evangelicalism is, just because they're using it wrongly. My evangelicalism fits more Wilberforce and John Stott and those figures like them, not some of what we see so often today. But Scopes trial, I think one of the areas where his impact is severely is that just the way we read history. So, whether someone's a literal young earth six-day creationist, an old earth creationist, or a theistic evolutionist, I think the tent within evangelicalism is big for that.
Right.
We had John Walton, a well-known biblical scholar, come and speak at our conference. He was one of our advisors. He's a professor at Wheaton. And we asked him to speak on hermeneutical humility for the conference. And, certainly the Genesis text is not even dealing with Darwin and, creationism type things. I mean, it's just like we should not anachronistically impose that on the text. And, we could get into that at some other point. All I'm
Right.
saying is we impose some things, and it doesn't mean I'm trying to take away from the young Earth creationists, or the old Earth creationists, or the theistic evolutionists. Let's just not make the biblical text speak to an issue it wasn't addressing in terms of these bigger questions that we ask today. They're important questions. But so it's impacted how we do hermeneutics, how we approach the Bible. And I'm not siding with any camp on that. I try to keep the conversation moving forward. I have a pastor friend, part of your old denomination, who said, you know, in his own congregation, it's a very large church out here. He said, I have people of all these stripes in my church. I say, can we have a conversation? But what I find is that often those who are young Earth creationists, not all, not I'm just saying, but some think that you're only orthodox if you're a young Earth creationist. That's hardly the case. When Darwin was having conversations with people who were evangelical, I mean, wherever he might have been coming theologically, Asa Gray, Harvard, or B.B. Warfield, the originator of our modern doctrine of inerrancy, didn't see a problem. Charles Hodge had issues for various reasons because of God's providential working, but it wasn't at all a sense in which Darwin was out of the conversation. There was effective, open conversations between evangelicals and Darwin. You don't get that from certain figures today, the way they talk about it. You cannot be a biblically based Christian if you're not a young Earth creationist. That's really unfortunate. That is extremely unfortunate. Historically, it's inaccurate. I say it's biblically inaccurate, and that doesn't mean that they don't have a place at the table, but they shouldn't impose that if you don't hold to their position, you're not with them. That's all I'm saying. But I would say that then you have people who are more on the theistic evolutionary side, who easily, because of the strident debate that even happens within the church, will look down their noses at people who are young Earth creationists. I think that's extremely unfortunate as well, and it deeply troubles me as well.
So do you look at the source of that inability to communicate back and forth, going back to its origination with scopes?
Well, I think it's part of it. I wouldn't say it's all of it, but I don't think we can discount it. I think the damage continues on. I think the suspicion of science, and I'm not saying everything that is presented as a scientific claim is therefore fact. I'm not saying that. I don't have a kind of scientific positivism, but the kind of fake news this, fake news that kind of language, no, bring your argument. Don't bring an allegation of fake news. Make an argument, not a tweet. So that's the type of thing that I think plays to that trauma, and it can easily feed off that trauma.
Right. So let's bounce over to coronavirus, COVID-19. How important is it for us as Christians to be listening to science right now?
Very much so. You'll say, well, what is science, right? Well, science is not as if it's like just one unitary dynamic. It's people, right? I mean, there are people who are scientists who are real people. And that's one of the things I loved about the Grand Initiative. You get to know scientists. They're not, space aliens, or not that I'm against space aliens, Phil. Okay, so but I think
you're not prejudiced against them.
That's right. The projections we have in the faith community toward many in the scientific community, just like you find it reversed toward people of faith. Sometimes you reach out to a scientist and you say, would you like to come and speak at a seminary? They're thinking, well, what do I have to say here? What kind of people are these? And you find out that they're real humans. But yeah, I mean, there's peer review, there's the accountability, and we can raise questions about certain claims that are made in the scientific community. Well, there were errors in the past. This will be shown to be erroneous in the future. One of our science advisors said when I was in medical school, 90%, he would say 90% of what we believe in the scientific community today is a critique of what I was taught when I was in med school. But that doesn't mean it's all fake. It doesn't mean it's all fake news. Right. We do have the peer review methodology analysis that is willing to keep going at it, And yes, there'll be, the renegades, the prophetic voices that will come forth and people say, nope, don't give them a hearing. But I think give it time.
You're talking about within the science community, right?
Yeah, within the, but
Yeah,
I interviewed a
yeah, yeah.
neuroscientist from Canada who's not a believer, but he said, most scientists are not trained in communication. By the time that they can
Right,
actually spend the time doing that, they're already tenured and toward the end of their career. And
right,
so, because it takes so much time for science to vet these things, and just the way the media portrays things today, there's often this disconnect, and so we have to account for it. But let me go directly to what you're asking with the coronavirus. Yeah, I think there's a huge vacuum. I think there's a
right.
huge vacuum in terms of like we need to be engaged in the scientific community all the more, and that's why I interviewed Gary Ferngren from Oregon Health and Science or Oregon State University, and then Robert Potter, who had been one of our scientific advisors, who was retired not too long ago from Oregon Health and Science University, speaking to these issues of what goes on here and how we need to account for it. But historically, Luther, I love quoting Luther and how he dealt with the plague in Wittenberg in the 16th century. He said, listen to the scientific community,
Mm,
learn from the scientific community, trust God, make sure we take precautions. If my neighbor needs my help and I'm not throwing caution to the wind, but really they need my help, regardless of what might come, I need to care. But
right.
Luther balanced out. It shouldn't be this extreme one or the other, but to enter into an effective dialogue. And I think we don't have enough of that in our community today.
Right, right, right. So I'm gonna drop back to um, something you were saying earlier about. I can't remember exactly your words, but it made me think of the parameters of scientific questions
Mm-hmm.
and some of the struggle that we might have in respect to the faith community. So you were talking about some of those prophetic voices within the science community who are the questioners. And who comes to mind immediately is, for me, having spent a lot of time in the UK, is Rupert Sheldrake. Are
Yep.
you familiar with him?
No.
And so he wrote a book in the UK. It was called The Science Delusion, and he's biologist, botanist specifically, and most of his work has been along the lines of this intersection of religion and science. And he challenged in his book, The Science Delusion, challenged the current parameters of scientific questioning and said that of course they're not going to discover anything spiritual because the parameters are too narrow. And he's not alone in that. Karl Popper, a philosopher of science, has challenged some of these narrow parameters of the scientific question. I don't have you come across that as a difficulty
Yeah, I
among
mean,
Christian scientists that you've probably dealt with?
well, I don't know if it has to be just Christian, but I think of Thomas Nagel in
Mm-hmm.
his book related to the mind and cosmos. If I recall correctly, that's the title where, he's challenging a form of materialism, but he's still a naturalist. He's not a believer, but
Right.
he would argue that the way in which the conversation has been framed uh, um, needs to be expanded, and yet he gets major. He's a philosopher,
Right.
just like John Searle, who's also, I think, raised some important questions on this subject. Um, but even Jane Bennett, in her book on disenchantment, going back to or enchanted universe, and like thinking of let me just get the source up. I want to make sure I have it to hand as I'm referring to it. Yeah, the enchantment of modern life. She goes back to Max Weber's statement about we live in a disenchanted universe. And I did a blog
Mm.
post at Pathos for my column there on Common God, Common Good, where I said, pagans and Christians have, I think, something in common, that we think that the world is enchanted. Um,
Yes. Yeah.
and
Yeah.
now that doesn't mean, some will say, well, you mean fairy tales and things of that sort. And, I mean, and Weber is trying to take on and critique a kind of primitive way of looking at the life where you might see fairies and so on and so forth just popping
Right.
up out of nature,
Right.
uh, and saying
Right.
that those
Right.
days are gone. The modern world is disenchanted. And Jane Bennett, who I don't think per se has an axe to grind theologically, Princeton University Press, talks about the only problem of having a world that's disenchanted, just dealing with it from a materialist perspective or a material perspective,
Right.
is when we operate within a Newtonian framework, a Newtonian orientation, where we look at matter as inert, in terms of Newton's idea of inert mass, that it's static. But if we see a form of, let me just quote her because I thought it was fascinating. She says, with Weber and Company, she says, there's no mention as there is in my altar story of a materialism where matter has a liveliness, a resilience, an unpredictability or recalcitrance that is itself a source of wonder for us. More on this, she says later, but that's page 64 of her book with Princeton, The Enchantment of Modern Life. So she's challenging some of those aspects. And I see Nagel, he just gets hammered by people for, just being out of touch. And it's like, well, why? Well, it's because he's challenging a certain kind of materialism, if you will. And he doesn't have a faith agenda, so to speak. And I think you see the same thing in Connor Cunningham's book, Erdman, several years ago, where he's challenging some of this and says that even in Darwin, there was a sense of teleology and purposiveness. And that's part of what's missing in certain quarters of science. Then you have also the systems biologist at Oxford, a colleague of Dawkins, who's trying to think of his Noble, I believe is his name, Music of Life. And where he says, instead of the selfish gene framework, we need to turn it upside down, is that that life is framed by way of the larger systems.
Right.
We're all locked into the selfish gene orchestration. So he sees merits to Dawkins, but he says we have to go far beyond that. It's in reframe it. My only point in all this is, yes, there's a need for challenging certain constructs, and I think that's always to be before us.
Right.
We all are guilty. We're all guilty of fundamentalism of a certain kind. I'm guilty of it, I'm sure. I just don't know it. And what I mean by the fundamentalism, whether conservative or liberal, is that we lock in, we have our own pet orthodoxies, and we're not open to dialogue. That's all I mean by it.
Right. Yeah, and there's certainly a place, my mention of Rupert Sheldrake, he's quite a rebel, and a lot of the scientific community just, plays him off as being some new age kook. A friend of mine, Stephen Simmons, makes a comment about his critique of neuroscience. It really only works within his own expansive version, which is probably true. But it's probably best for us, as is my approach when I'm dealing with people of other worldviews. It's best if those within the house critique their own, right?
Yeah.
So we pastors and theologians ought to be critiquing our own worldview and its engagement with the outside world. But then, as far as science, they should be going at themselves as well in some ways, right?
So
everybody clean their own house.
Yeah, I mean, you think about the Reformation dictum or the mantra of, being reformed, not simply being reformed, but that we're being reformed. Being reformed daily by the word. And so, what are those constructs that we impose on the biblical text? I have colleagues in Hebrew studies where they have their students sketch out, just, okay, look at Genesis 1 and 2 and draw the cosmos as you see it presented. Right. And people tend to draw it in a modern way. But they'll say, well, no, actually it was like a brass canopy.
Right.
It's like, we don't see that, but that's how it's in the Near Eastern world.
So I'm going to make a little switch here to a question that I'd mentioned to you the other day that I find interesting, and I suppose here I'm getting a little bit moving toward the postmodern deconstructionism of some kind, or at least that's the critique. So, Foucault, in his first kind of land-breaking book back in the early 60s, History of Madness, tracked a movement in um, in the communities of faith and healing and science and psychology, that the priesthood seemed to be moving. As far as the public was concerned, the priesthood had moved from being the religionist to becoming the scientist over time, and the doctor, the scientist and the doctor. They became the new priests. And of course, he tracked this with initially madness was viewed as a moral problem, and then it became moved into becoming a physical. It was a moral problem. It was a spiritual problem. It became a physical or medical problem, and so we had a new priest. And we've certainly seen over the course of my lifetime, science is becoming increasingly apocalyptic, which is some perhaps evidence of a growing kind of priesthood capacity that some scientists are taking on, or at least it seems to be that way. We've gone from the destruction of the world to pandemics and sicknesses that are killing us, and we're listening to the scientist in a sense as a priest, and in some ways. Does this say something about the times in which we live? How does that speak to the church?
Yeah, well, I think it's certainly a complex question, and when we talk about priesthood, or what I think we're talking about, authority, like ultimate authority, right? And Robert Funk, who is the Jesus Seminar, talked about the pre-modern world. Authority was framed by way of the priest. There's another way of going at the same issue. The modern period, it's much more the physicist.
Right.
And the postmodern, depending on how you look at it, could be much more the poet. You were thinking more the scientists. I think in some ways those who can construct the world in terms of aesthetics and what's most beautiful, and this was Kant's third critique, that the aesthetic artistic judgment, that it's the artistic genius who connects the realms of morality, of human science and natural science. So Funk said that it was actually the priest where we find authority is in terms of the artist, the poet. And I think that also has some interesting connotations and associations. But all that to say, I think there are different kinds of authority, different kinds of priesthood, if you will.
Right.
And certainly on the coronavirus, I do want to hear from the scientists. I definitely. But what am I looking at them for?
No, come on. Copeland will blow your coronavirus away.
Stephen Hawking, and like we talk about the end of the world, he certainly talked in very apocalyptic terms about the end of the world, that, we only had so many years left. I think I need to take seriously what climatologists say. We interviewed a leading one not too long ago for new wine tastings. But a friend of mine who's the head of the environmental studies program at Portland, University of Portland, Steve Combs, said, science is really good at making maps, but it's not good at giving directions. Now, he's a scientist. He's an evolutionary biologist by trade. He's a person of faith. He says science makes great maps, but it doesn't give us directions, so to speak, on how to operate in terms of the life sojourn. Right. And I think it's only problematic when any discipline goes beyond its boundaries. And trying to discern what those boundaries are is $1 million question. I get that.
Right.
But sometimes you'll see Dawkins or Hawking take off their science hat, put on and you see this with Wilson too, E.O. Wilson, and then they start asking questions that really put them in the realm of theology.
Right.
But everyone says, well, they're scientists. No, they just took off the science hat. They're not philosophers of science. So I think that's where it becomes problematic. I think I have to, if someone asks me, do you think that they're becoming apocalyptic and function as priests, I say, well, give me an example. I can't just say yes. Give me an example, and then we can discuss it. But I do see that with Hawkins a lot. I see it with Dawkins.
Right.
Sam Harris.
Sam Harris. popular voices.
Yeah, and I'm working on a book with a secular humanist right now where, they're often referred to as the four horsemen of the apocalypse with Dennett.
Right.
And, the conversation's kind of moved on beyond them toward
Right.
more ironic, open-minded atheists and secular humanists
Right.
who can really have a conversation with toward human flourishing and what leads us there. So, but I mentioned before, if I can go back to historiography, and this,
Okay.
and feel free to push back and keep me on, but I wanted to go back to Freud, I had said at one point.
Right.
And I think Freud's a precursor to some of this. And with his historiography, which, as I said earlier, Neil deGrasse Tyson picks up on in Superman versus Batman. So I think you're going to see some of the eschatology and apocalyptic coming in. So just see if this works for you, Phil.
Okay.
But it might have been in his lectures on psychoanalysis back in 1928 or so, but Freud said that the three great, nails in the coffin, so to speak, to the traditional view of humanity as sacred and, at the center of the universe, so to speak, were Copernicus, Darwin, and himself. Copernicus because he made the sun the center of the universe. Darwin because he saw us as fundamentally connected to the animal realm. And Freud because we don't even have freedom in our own thoughts because we're basically determined by what happens below the surface, so to speak, in terms of consciousness. Well, he was wrong on Copernicus because, center of the universe for Aristotle and company and Dante, that's not a good place to be. It's the deepest depths of hell. So that's a projection. It wasn't at all that way for someone like Copernicus. And that's where we're going to come back to Neil deGrasse Tyson. For Darwin, he didn't see his claims as fundamentally anti-faith. I mean, he might not have been a person of great faith himself, but it was in many respects because of the problem of evil. And, how could people who were good people in his family go to hell? His daughter who passed away, it really had nothing to do with the evolutionary issues, so to speak, as I see it. It was other questions, and he felt that you could not go to him and science on questions of morality. You had to go to philosophy and religion and such. So he maintained that distinction, but it was really Freud himself who created that historiography where it's most problematic. And with that, that's where Neil deGrasse Tyson goes. He says with Superman and Batman, we see we're not so significant because this man from outer space comes in and we realize there's much more out there, far greater than we are, so we're insignificant. And I think we look to those kinds of, other world experiences. It's not heaven, but it's Mars.
Right.
We need to leave this world to go to space. So when Hawkins and others say, we need to leave this world, maybe Elon Musk, they're asking eschatological questions. And they play the high priest there. It's very apocalyptic at times.
Right.
Not to say that there shouldn't be some wrestling with that as scientists, but just admit that that's not always science. Those are matters of philosophy of science. Those are matters of faith of different kinds. And I think that that's the issue is Neil deGrasse Tyson's a great scientist, just not a great historian of science.
Right. Which is the same problems. The same problems we have with the other popular writers. Harris is a terrible historian, primarily of religion, right? And that's where the difficulty comes in. The defining of our house by the outsider, and when I'm described as an evangelical, I wouldn't recognize myself in their definitions, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's probably where most of us fall. So on the whole,
that's one of the things I love most about you, Phil, is just that, and again, this wasn't planned for your audience, but you're someone I respect greatly. Just have the greatest admiration for, because I feel that one, you're true to your biblical convictions, you're true to your evangelical moorings, but the way you can converse out of the box, it really is so striking and endearing to me. And I'm really grateful for your friendship and just your missional thrust. It's just amazing to me.
Oh, thank you. Coming from you, that's pretty big, because I've seen you on your home ground, among the Buddhist community, and I'm really impressed too.
very kind. Yeah, we're not even drinking this morning. We're not even drinking.
Oh, dang. This would have been hot if we did this at night and we had some brews. So John Moorhead's watching, and he says,
Uh-oh.
yeah, he says, two of my favorite bearded dudes. This has been great, Paul. Thank you so much. You've made you've made a pretty hot dialogue on a pretty hot topic, and I think there's people who have something to gain from this. So thank you.
Could we just bring attention to John's recent edited book? I don't know if he really is listening, or if it's a drone or whatever. But let me just draw attention to that, because the work we did with John and others, Jill was part of that.
Right.
David, Carrie, and
right.
Bob, with the Louisville grant,
right,
was I just want to draw attention, because that brought up science as well. Do you have a minute, Phil?
Yeah, I mean, and I'm going to say something here. So John is watching. John, would you put a link to that book in the comments here for us?
Just came out, Charitable Orthopathy, where John and colleagues are dealing with, and with his co-editor are dealing with, Brandon Benzinger, are dealing with the subject of the emotions, the affections, and how that shapes us in how we engage the religious other. And I just think that's cutting edge work. John often draws from the social sciences, like Jonathan Haidt's work, with moral foundations, and how we're all shaped, liberal and conservative alike, are shaped by these moral intuitions or affections, whatever you want to call them, that really we're wired that way. And I have found in my own work with the Templeton AAAS grant, Haidt's work as an evolutionary biologist, social psychologist, who's an atheist, but very open to engage in religion, unlike the Four Horsemen, who sees a need for constructive engagement. He has so much to teach us and offer us, and John's done phenomenal work over the years in that regard. And so I just want to thank John for the work, and that we were able to partner with him in that grant initiative with Louisville. Charitable Orthopathy.
Yeah, and unfortunately, Multi-Faith Matters wasn't able to get together last week. This last weekend.
We're going to do it in Austin, right? We're still going to do it.
That's the plan. I'm looking forward to having Bruce with you in Austin.
Social sciences, faith, it's all part of it.
And Jim Fontaine suggests that, well, next time there needs to be some drunken ramblings of the bearded wonders.
Well, please join us.
Okay, and so John Moorhead has given the link to the Charitable Orthopathy. So how can people find out more about you, Paul?
Well, New Wine, New Wineskins, new-wineskins.org. We're at Facebook. I write a lot at Pathos, write a lot generally, so they could check out Amazon page if they like. Again, New Wine, New Wineskins, new-wineskins.org. And finishing up a book on the church calendar for Cascade right now, and a book on social ethics for InterVarsity Academic. And now starting a new initiative with my good friend, and we like to say co-conspirators, Tom Crademaker, who's out at Yale in communications, and he and I are working on a book. He is a secular humanist, and myself as an evangelical Christian, on how to have a more constructive dialogue. So whether it's the social ethics book, the liturgy book, or those are some of my current projects, and also the website paullouismetzger.com. So, and just looking forward to the next time we can hang out, Phil, and thanks to you and for your colleagues for joining us.
Yeah, I want to read you something here from Andrew Thomas, my friend who's the molecular biologist at Cardiff Metropolitan. So he says to you, Paul, sounds like you're doing great work. If religion and science can work together effectively, we can change the world for good. I thought that 30 years of good science could address these problems. I was wrong. The top environmental problems are selfishness, greed, and apathy, And to deal with these, we need a cultural and spiritual transformation. And we scientists don't know how to do that.
Would your friend be willing to be interviewed at my Pathos blog? Because I love interviewing scientists on these themes, whether it's on climatology, neuroscience, social psychology, biology.
Yeah.
Interviewing scientists, whether people of faith or not. I just love to engage. So if he's open to that, I'd love to do so.
So Andrew Thomas, I'm assuming you're still listening. You heard that, and Paul wants you on his blog at Pathio. So I know he'd be interested. I did one of these wild theology podcasts with him. So
yeah, he could check out Uncommon God, Common Good, and we're doing interested in interviewing scientists too for my new wine tasting series at YouTube for new wineskins.
Yeah. Well. Okay. So this has been Paul Louis Metzger from Multnomah University, and I'm Phil Wyman. This is the Wild Theology Podcast, and you can find me at patreon.com/Phil Wyman, or this will be up not only here on Facebook, but it'll pop up on YouTube as well. Oh, Paul, you rock. This was fun.
This is a lot of fun. Thank you, Phil. And again, thanks for your colleagues too joining us.
Hey, rock on, bro. Have a brew.
All the best. Bye.